We may be a long way off of what in science fiction shows and movies looks like a common vision of the world or even the galaxy. We're not there, and if anything, we've gone in an opposite direction. And I'm not sure that that's a bad thing.
Hello, my name is Ben Charland. Welcome to What on Earth is Going On. On this show, I take you beneath the headlines to discuss the events, the forces, the characters, and the ideas that shape the human story today. Each week, we talk with somebody who thinks deeply about what is going on, whether that's climate change or psychology or artificial intelligence, you name it. Why are things happening? How did they come to be? And where are we all headed? If you have any questions or feedback, please get in touch. You can find this show online at wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. Find it on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. You can download episodes on whatever podcast app that you use. But most of all, make your voice heard in the ongoing conversation. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to play my discussion with the principal of Queen's University and the renowned historian Daniel Wolff. We're going to discuss history, jazz, and of course, what on earth is going on today, and that is coming up. One of the most compelling subjects that I want to tackle on this show is virtual reality. Because VR goggles have been around for decades now, we can see what's going on behind them as a fad that is constantly predicted to be overwhelming, but never quite materializes. That said, there are discoveries and advances taking place right now which have major implications for our economy, our politics, our understanding of self and reality, indeed for the very idea of consciousness itself. Virtual reality or augmented reality or Google Glass, whatever we want to call it, the subject does not just touch on the hard problem of consciousness in science and philosophy, but on the very meaning and value of the world we think that we're living in. The inventor and entrepreneur Elon Musk not too long ago suggested that the likelihood that we are living in so-called base reality, in other words, the likelihood that this reality in which I am speaking into a microphone and you're listening to my voice, the likelihood that this reality is real and not a simulation, is something like 1 in a billion. Why? Because it seems like our civilization is on a path whereby pretty soon we will be able to create virtual reality, say in the form of a high-definition and extremely responsive video game that is indistinguishable from the reality that we know. It could have all the sights, the smells, tastes, sounds, and feelings that we're used to, and therefore we could be in that simulation as we speak, just like the film The Matrix. If that's possible, it means that it will almost certainly happen, and if it will happen, what's to say it hasn't already happened? Maybe we are in a simulation of a simulation of a simulation, and so forth. For another film reference, there's the dream within a dream within a dream of Inception from 2010. The reason why this is ripe for conversation, maybe more so than when The Matrix was released in 1999, is that we are getting closer to building virtual reality that is in fact indistinguishable from our reality. For your third film reference, there's Ready Player One from this year, based on the book from 2011 by Ernest Cline. In it, our overpopulated civilization is in obvious decline, but everybody is linked up on the Oasis, a massive global VR network where you can play out your fantasies and ignore what's really happening. Unfortunately, this film is little more than an action-packed blast of pop culture references and nerd pornography, and it fails to ask the much more juicy questions of virtual reality and what the future looks like. In any case, all of this does beg the perennial question, what on earth is going on here? I want to talk about an article I read in The New Yorker from April 2nd, written by Joshua Rothman, called As Real as It Gets. This piece starts off in the philosophy of consciousness and the study of out-of-body experiences. Rothman, the writer, goes to a well-regarded VR lab in Barcelona where he is plugged into various experimental machines. He has out-of-body experiences, he steps into the shoes of other people in a virtual reality, and he feels a phantom touch when his virtual limbs interact with virtual objects and his real limbs experience real feelings. One of the most profound moments in Rothman's article is when he has a conversation between himself and Sigmund Freud, the 19th century Austrian psychologist, in which he acts and speaks as himself, and then he acts and speaks as if he was Freud. Using virtual reality goggles, he sees a computer-generated version of himself. He's immersed, and that computer-generated version of himself is something that the lab made from a scan of his body. He's sitting across from a similarly generated version of Sigmund Freud. At the press of a button, he can rotate between the two bodies, and in doing so, he has a 20-minute conversation between him as himself and him as Freud. Through Freud, he says things to himself about his real-life problems that he never would have said or considered otherwise. Indeed, it was as if he was two different people having a real dialogue. He felt like he was Freud when he was embodied in Freud. Now, if we trust that this is possible, and remember that Rothman is hardly the first or the last person to go through this particular experience, then we can obviously ask what doors this opens for our virtual future. Not just psychology, but medicine, not just gaming, but how we live our lives, and not just experience, but consciousness. What does it mean to be you? René Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." But just because I think and therefore am does not mean that there are definitions and dimensions of reality that I am not seeing. It does not mean that you are not being deceived by what you think is real. 18th century philosopher George Berkeley argued that all reality was purely in our minds. But this is not just speculation or hokey philosophy. As is becoming apparent in labs like the one that Rothman visited in Barcelona, our conception of ourselves and our reality is crucial for understanding, say, mental illness, as well as mental fitness. Maybe consciousness is a byproduct of my reality, which makes sense if we realize that our brains make decisions milliseconds before they have time to process the information into conscious thought. In other words, the thought of a decision comes after the brain takes action. It's a reversal of the cause and effect relationship we intuitively assume. Consciousness is arguably just our brain's attempt to explain itself to itself. This notion is given some impetus from experiments from people who have had their right and left brains severed from one another in order to prevent seizures. Because language is almost exclusively the domain of the left side of the brain, then if they're disconnected, the right side might perceive something, but it won't be able to describe it, and moreover, it won't even really be conscious of it. And yet, if the perception causes action, say the words "step forward" on a piece of paper causes the person to step forward, then the left brain, disconnected from the perception of the right, will come up with an explanation for that step forward after the fact, such as, "I'm thirsty." Totally false, but the person is totally convinced. As we go deeper and deeper into virtual reality and step further and further away from the only selves we humans have ever known, what questions and answers will we uncover? What other paradoxes are we yet to encounter? One last point about this is story. I often use this word story on this program, whether in my attempt to get to the bottom of what on earth is going on, or in the principal query, what are the events, characters, forces, and ideas that shape the human story today? It's important, this word, because I think we conceive of the world through story. It seems to be that it is a fundamental aspect of who we are, something that goes beyond nurture and might even be encoded in our DNA. Why else are there 7 basic plots, or 2 kinds of stories, or 1 general arc of a narrative? Why is it that we remember and tell stories about everything? We package information in story. whether 2,000 years ago in Greek tragedy or today in a Facebook post. And at the root of all of this is the story, the fiction that we tell ourselves to get by from day to day. I am me. I sit here. I speak into this microphone. Well, what will it mean when I can watch myself doing this at a distance and become someone or something else entirely? What happens when I forget that I can take the goggles off? Some food for thought, and I do plan to return to this. In the meantime, here's my conversation with a storyteller himself, Daniel Wolff. Dr. Daniel Wolff has been the principal and Vice-Chancellor of Queen's University since 2009. He continues to teach part-time and is a specialist in early modern British cultural history and the history of historical thought and writing. Principal Wolff is a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, the Royal Society of Canada, and the Royal Historical Society. He is the author or editor of numerous books on history and historiography, including the 5-volume Oxford History of Historical Writing, and he's one of the few people who can say that he's edited an encyclopedia, that of historical writing. He's a fan of jazz, and you can tune into his show here on CFRC called Dark Glasses every Monday at 2 p.m. Principal Wolff, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Ben. Glad to be here.
Great. So we live in a time of flux, disruption, and rapid transformation. Climate change, upended politics, vast new horizons of technology, and it all seems to be happening so quickly. You study not just history, but how we write and conceive of history. It's impossible to ask you or anyone else to view this present moment with 2020 vision, but nonetheless, the first draft of the human story is being written right now. As best as you can tell, what on earth is going on?
Well, that's a really good question. It's what used to be called the $64 question back in the 50s. I guess it'd be the $64 million question right now.
Yeah.
No question whatsoever, we are at a time of enormous change. But often we don't get perspective on the significance of that change until much, much, much later. One of the things that's different about the current moment is just the degree to which things are so interconnected across the globe that you hear in real time, almost instantaneously on your Twitter feed or Facebook, what's happening half a world away. And we'll come back to this point, but that wasn't always the case. In past times, news traveled very, very slowly. So there was, even though there were some fairly important disruptions going on, say during industrialization, you didn't always have that sense of immediacy. Right now, we have, I would say, some very, very positive things happening in terms of medicine, the ability to keep people alive who with a reasonable quality of life that you wouldn't have had 10, 20, 30 years ago. The connectivity is great. In terms of the internet and devices, I just Alexa'd my house over the weekend, so I'm getting used to a robot turning on my lights and so forth. But all these things come with a downside as well. Politically, it's an exceedingly dangerous time. We have a number of rogue states in the world, the usual suspects, whom I won't name, and a neighbor to the south that is rapidly becoming a rogue state, as witnessed by this weekend's, song and dance and temper tantrum by its president at the G7. So I would say it's a very, very unstable and worrying time. Is it more worrying than, say, other crises, World War II, the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Sure.
I don't think it's quite at that stage yet politically. I think it could get there. But then there are other, even more existential threats, including climate change and the environment, things that, if we don't solve in this generation or the next, it's going to be tough for our successors in the 22nd century.
Right.
I'm a Trekkie from way back, and I like to think of Earth having a bright future, humanity having a bright future, and so forth. And some things are looking very, very positive in terms of, level of education across the world. Some things continue to look negative, including, for instance, the high degree of income variation in many parts of the world, even within Canada, but certainly in many parts of what used to be called the third world. We now call it the developing world or even emerging markets.
Sure.
So that's one historian's analysis of what's going on now. But it's also important to realize that this is not the first time that there have been major disruptions,
of course,
in terms of human history.
But there are some things about right now that are truly exceptional, especially technology, climate change, automation, the vast changes to the labor market. You mentioned Star Trek, and I think that might give us a good question, which is that Star Trek as a series is founded on the idea of human progress, that we are building and building and building towards a future that we may not be able to even conceive of properly today, but it will be in some way better or more advanced, and that we can learn to solve our problems if we have the right attitude towards, say, the technology that we develop. But I think that perhaps one of the things that's happening right now is that the story of progress is under threat and perhaps is being put into grave doubt. It seems like people like Donald Trump, the president of the United States, and other world leaders and the people who vote for them are questioning that this idea of progress is even happening. Perhaps progress is actually, in their minds, the progress of the elites taking more and more money and the poor getting poorer and poorer, running away with everything, while under this illusion that, oh, don't worry, everything's getting better. So in other words, the rich are getting richer, but real wages are not really increasing. That's just one example. Do you think that the story itself of progress is under threat?
I think it depends who you ask, but it's also important to remember that the whole story of progress is really not much more than 250 years old. I work, as you said in your very well-researched introduction, I might add, I work on the period of early modern history, primarily in Britain, but also on the continent as well, between around the mid-15th and early 18th century. And there was very little idea of progress, certainly not into the future. Some people had a notion that certain technological things had improved. The classic examples that Renaissance thinkers such as Francis Bacon used to use was that there were three things that the ancients had not had that their own time did. For example, the printing press, the compass, and gunpowder. And so there was some acknowledgement that technical progress had occurred, but there was also a sense, particularly in the Renaissance, that antiquity had been the perfection of humanity, and actually all knowledge had been somehow given to humanity at the beginning of time. Remember, of course, this is a very scripture-bound society at the time, and so they also believed that the world was only about 4,000 or so years old, and would inevitably end in the not too distant future in some kind of biblically prophesied apocalypse. So it wasn't easy to conceive of a kind of vision of society and the world that extended well into the future at that point. When you get to the 18th century, things do change a little bit, and you start, for example, to get a sense that things are actually changing, but also that there is a duty to make them better still. Now, there were revolutionaries before then, but their idea was usually to turn the clock back to some imagined past perfect society. So the reformers of the 16th century, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and so forth, and many of the sectaries and religious minorities that followed in the 17th century, they did not see that they were founding a kind of future utopia. They saw that they were returning to what they sometimes called primitive religion, as it had existed in early Christian times. So, but then again, in the 18th century, a whole bunch of things start happening. Growth in literacy, considerable increase in the circulation of books through libraries and so forth. You have dawning in various parts of Europe the movement that we collectively call the Enlightenment, although it unfolds quite differently in parts of Europe than in other parts of Europe. But generally speaking, that evinces a notion of progress. And by the time you get to the time of the French Revolution, there very much is the idea that humanity is perfectible technologically, manners or customs or behavior can be reformed. The old idea, a very sort of macho idea of masculinity going back to the Middle Ages, is gradually giving way to a more rounded, sentimental, genteel notion of how men should behave. So the kind of gentleman depicted in Jane Austen at the very beginning of the 19th century, he's quite different from the depiction of the sort of sword-fighting, dueling gentleman you would get in a 16th century or early 17th century conduct book.
Right. Does this go hand in hand with in your introduction to a global history of history, you talk about how there are two different kinds of history, lowercase and uppercase.
Oh, you really did your homework.
I try. And that lowercase history is the history, real history, the work of historians, but capital H history is the work of politicians, of generals, of public figures who are trying to shape a story and say that, for example, history is on our side or that the human destiny is leading to one place. So is this idea of progress actually an episode of capital H history?
I think it is, but the two exist together because it is interesting. You don't really get what I've called capital H history, the notion that there's a kind of cumulative flow to events, beginning in prehistoric times and leading to progress. I'll use another science fiction example, 2001: A Space Odyssey, one of my favorite movies. Where does it start? Of course, with a bunch of Australopithecine or primates beating each other up over water. Suddenly, the monolith intervenes, and progress starts. Before you know it, you have the famous scene where the bone is tossed up and it turns into a space satellite. So that right there is an 18th century notion of progress, or maybe even more of a 19th century one, because you've got the whole technology and industrialization aspect to it as well. Prior to having that notion of progress, there were notions that things happened in history, but there was very little sense that there was a kind of cumulative course, with the sole exception of the realm of religion. The notion, which really goes back to ancient Judaic ideas of history, which Christians took over, that there was a creation, there would be an apocalyptic end of times, and that there was a kind of sacred plot to history that God alone knew, and that we humans were just acting in a very transitory sort of way.
In your work in historiography, you do a lot to sort of reclaim the ground as global history or world history, to say that European history and historiography has dominated for a long time, but there are not only other histories but other ways of writing and telling history, or oral history, for example. And I know that some people have argued that, say, in China or India, people's view of history or the human story is much more cyclical, where sure there may be progress, but the progress will always go back down. Whereas this Western idea is the constant rise of human evolution. Is part of what's going on now sort of a convergence of these ideas, perhaps?
I think it's a convergence, but it goes back a ways. I think the convergence actually starts in earnest in the late 19th century, and it is a kind of historiographical imperialism that mirrors the actual imperialism of the West, and colonizing much of the rest of the world and influencing economically and politically those parts that it didn't directly colonize, China, for example. And one of the interesting things is just how keenly many parts of the world that previously had very, very different historical practices, China, Japan, India, how eagerly they adopted Western ways of thinking about history, almost as if the social reformers of the day somehow conceived that they were not able to keep up with the West simply because they didn't have the same sense of history and progress that the West did. Give you China as an example. The Chinese practiced history well before anybody in the West did. We frequently talk about Herodotus and Thucydides as the fathers of history, and certainly in the Greek and European tradition, they definitely have that sort of status. But Greece is not the whole world, and people were writing things that were historical in China back, 500-600 years BC. We have I won't go into listing particular texts, but it's a very, very different tradition. It was a very, very well-developed tradition involving both official and unofficial history and so forth. But it did tend to be fairly cyclical and not envisage what we would regard as progress. And when you get to the late 19th century and the kind of reintroduction of Western contact with China and Japan, the Japanese were actually first to adopt this, and then it sort of spread to China, the notion that if we can develop a Western-type sense of historical movement and progress, then we will socially be able to progress. For the Japanese case, after 200 years of having very little influence from outside the West, suddenly they were simply overwhelmed by a bunch of gunboats from the U.S. The Meiji Restoration of the Emperor's full power started pretty soon thereafter. And again, social reformers thought, well, what we need to do is we need to import a bunch of Germans who were then regarded as the kind of acme of historical scholarship and practice pretty much throughout the Western world from the mid to the late 19th century. Bring them in, train our scholars. Same idea spread to China very soon. India, same sort of thing, with the exception of the fact that, of course, the British were actually ruling in India. And you had reformers from the mid-19th century up to Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister of independent India, claiming that there needed to be a kind of narrative of India's progress, and that all there was previously was a bunch of ancient lore, various Buddhist and Hindu texts, many of them oral, which I think can reasonably be regarded as a type of history. But in an effort to escape from that, seeing that as a point of weakness which allowed dominance by the West, they thought that the best thing to do was to adopt the very weapon that the West had used in terms of explaining its natural dominance over less developed countries and turn it back on them. And in the 20th century, in the late 20th and early 21st century, we've seen an interesting further change on that with social reformers and literary critics, particularly on the post-colonial side, taking issue with their own predecessors' adoption of those Western forms of history. And one of the most interesting things I found in writing the chapter on that subject was we all often think of Gandhi and Nehru in the same breath. They're close allies and so forth, but they had exactly opposite views in terms of what sort of history Indians should be practicing. Nehru, let's adopt the Western course. When in prison, he wrote a series of letters to his daughter, the future Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, about world history. Gandhi took the opposite view, very much anticipating what we would call the post-colonial view, that Western historicity has been used as a tool to impose imperialism on we, the colonized.
And I think that the tension of colonialism is also a big factor in our world today, not just in societies that are now post-colonial, but in all societies, because I think colonialism for so long was the sort of the dominant, one of the dominant forces in the world, in the movement of capital, the movement of labor, but also their movement of resources, of knowledge, of trade, of books. And today we're now seeing the aftermath of this colonial idea transforming into something else, or perhaps being eliminated altogether, because there is no single thing that everyone wishes they could be. or at least there are many now. I think that's what, say, Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping of China want to say, is that we now live in a polycentric or a multipolar world. And this has ramifications for our story, our history, I think.
And I think you're absolutely right. This is a very astute point. And some historians, not all of them post-colonial, have evinced the notion of what is called multiple modernities, that the very notion of modernity itself must be understood as having plural outcomes. We used to think that there was a kind of very, very direct course, and this again goes back to the idea of progress, and it very much involved Western styles of civility, Western technology, Western this, Western that, and so forth. Now we see, even among societies or countries that are now highly industrialized, Russia, relatively highly industrialized, Russia and China, the notion that, well, hey, our modernity doesn't have to equal the same modernity as the U.S. and so forth. So I think you're right. Another way of looking at it is to say that there is no kind of universal vision as to what the world should look like. And that's going back to Star Trek, suggesting that we may be a long way off of what in science fiction shows and movies looks like a common vision of the world or even the galaxy.
Sure.
And we're not there. And if anything, we've gone in an opposite direction. And I'm not sure that that's a bad thing. I mean, we've had 2 or 3 centuries, arguably earlier, if you go back to the period, the first period of European imperial expansion between the 15th and the 17th century, we've had, half a millennium of, European dominance, European technology, and a European narrative of the progress of humankind. And, maybe that progress of humankind has several stories and not just one.
Sure, and I think that would almost be intuitive, but also against what many people in the West, at least, have been brought up to think of the world as. I'm sure you know of the historian Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*.
Yes,
and I've
very much.
referenced him a couple of times on the show.
Yeah.
And one thing that he said in an interview, I think he was actually literally asked the question, "What on earth is going on?" And his answer was, "Our story is broken." That the story, that the narrative that we have come to believe about ourselves and our society and our civilization, the West, is broken. And people are scrambling to come up with a new one, whether that's Make America Great Again, or that's Star Trek, or that's something in between, or that's even something as technical as a universal basic income. So if all the jobs are going to be eroded by automation, well, then we need to have some new way of organizing our society. And that may just be a technical check in your bank or an application in your tax form. However, it creates a story of what your life is about. If you spend most of your time working, then the meaning of your life is work, whether or not you define it that way in your leisure time. But if the bulk of your life is leisure, then the meaning of your life is leisure or religion or whatever. And I think that this notion of story and a broken story, and now us trying to piece it together, almost in a Hegelian sort of way, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, may be animating what's happening in our world today.
Wow, there is a lot in what you just said. I don't even know where to begin, but let me start with the notion of story. I think you're right. I think we do have a broken story right now, and there is, and you can see this in the historical discipline, because there has been a flight really over the last 40 or 50 years, but even more so in the last 10 or 20, from grand narratives. I mean, obviously people do write textbooks and surveys. My own global history is an attempt to generalize about a bunch of things that probably oversimplifies in the interest of clarity. I've just actually sent off the manuscript of a much more concise version of the same book, and I found the process of digesting and cutting frankly even harder than writing the thing in the first place, because the more you try and come up with a grand and simple narrative, the more you're leaving out. And we live in a society that doesn't like generalization, is always coming up with counterexamples and so forth. And again, the conventional narrative of the world's progress, I think, has been challenged. I think it's been challenged for some time. Various countries have actually dealt with this in different ways. I mean, Germany is a good example because it had to deal in the post-war period, and is still dealing with it in many ways, with the fact that what was once regarded as the most civilized country in the world had, really the seat of, classical scholarship, a good deal of science and so forth.
And professional history.
Professional historiography had turned for a period first into a militaristic imperial state leading up to World War I, and then into an appallingly bad Nazi state, and how to explain this aberration. And aberrations do occur. I think we're actually, or at least I hope we're seeing a short-term one just south of the border, but only time will tell.
Yeah.
The other thing that happens is stories don't last very long. So you mentioned that we're looking at things like universal basic income, but and I'm not making a comment on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing at all. But these causes that seem to provide a kind of underpinning or a common thread don't tend to last very long. We'll be on to the next slogan in 3 or 4 years or less. Notions such as liberty or reform or natural rights or natural law had a much, much greater longevity. But I think the speed of communications, again, there's that downside to technology, means we all have a very short attention span, and we all have a very short set of patience with particular terms, and we're just waiting for the next clever term to come along. Sometimes it's the same idea, and just the term changes, but human beings have much less sense of patience now, I think, than they used to be, just simply because we are just so used to constant change. Every day there is change.
Right.
Every day we look to the news to see what is happening. And I read an article about 20 years ago that theorized that the very notion of a kind of present as a kind of zone in which we live, as opposed to simply a sort of moment, as a simple moment between past and future, actually originates in the 17th century with the multiplication of organs of news. Obviously not electronic the way we have now, but it was now reasonably possible to find out within a few days or a week what happened at this battle or that battle in a way it hadn't been before, whereas previously an event would be historical before you even heard about it.
Right.
Then you had in the 19th century the telegraph and the railroad, and much more now with instantaneous breaking news across the Twitter feed.
Yeah. And
it's no wonder that we seem to be much more fixated on the present than either on the past or the future.
And it's not just change, it's disruption, I think. That, change may be a constant, even if it's gradual. But what we're seeing right now is a disruption of the everyday and of our story. I think that it was de Tocqueville, and I'm probably butchering the quote, who said that the essence of democracy in America, which is what he was looking at in the 19th century, is that you could have a newspaper drop the same thought into 1,000 minds at once. And I think that we may have now so many different organs of media that it's not dropping the same thought. You have the same, say, news article, the same event, the same person, but as many different stories or different thoughts as there are people receiving it. And that may be, I don't want to say undemocratic, maybe non-democratic or ademocratic.
Well, I think that's right, and that's, of course, where it's no coincidence that we are in an era of what has been called fake news and alternative facts. Where does authority lie? even in modernity, in, say, the 1960s, if people wanted to get a kind of reassuring take on what was going on in the events, they would tune into one of three networks. Walter Cronkite was, trusted by everybody who watched CBS News and so forth. Now, then we've got cable and multiple news. We've got Fox News on the one hand. We've got CNN. So whom do you believe? And then if you throw in the fact that there is any number of apps that you can get your news from, again, authority has been questioned. We've seen this phenomenon before. This is, of course, what people worried about when print was introduced, that the church, traditionally through the Middle Ages, had exclusive authority in terms of interpreting, scripture, because pretty much only the clergy could actually read. They were all in Latin. Then you suddenly get things put into vernacular languages, and of course the great worry is that it was going to democratize religion, which to a certain degree it did. It was particularly once literacy rates improved, and you then do get rival notions of truth, different confessional divisions, Protestant, Catholic, and so forth. By the time you get to the 18th and 19th century, and the development of what the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas has called the public sphere, which I think is actually anticipated much earlier with newsbooks and so forth, but let's just say Habermas is right, and it really is a post-French Revolutionary phenomenon. Then people are able to discourse about things. On one hand, that's a profoundly democratic thing. On the other hand, if the truth or knowledge or fact is coming in so many different organs, how do you determine what is actually legitimate and what isn't?
Right.
Within the academy, of course, we have certain ways of verifying truth. For example, the process of peer review of journals and academic publications. So I know if I read a book from, say, Cambridge University Press or Harvard University Press, that it's been through a rigorous process, and that there may well be things I disagree with, points of interpretation, but it's not going to be out and out lies or inventions.
Right.
For the most part, I mean, even the best academic press has loopholes.
But the thing that we all would believe in looking at that is there's an attempt to get to the truth.
Yes.
Even if I disagree with the methods, and even if I disagree with your conclusion, I know you've tried to get to the truth, and now it's incumbent upon me to write, say, an alternative book. Not alternative facts, but an alternative book.
That's right. Yes.
To say no, I think that this is maybe the reason, but we're not. We still share in certain assumptions. We still share. I guess you could go back to the idea of story. There's a certain story that is shared that is being fragmented beyond anything that maybe anybody could imagine. And I guess to play devil's advocate, maybe to both of us, there are the technophiles of Silicon Valley, so to speak, who say every other time there's been massive technological change, it's gone well in the end. There are the people who defend free trade and say, look, free trade, for example, has concentrated harms, but it has diffuse benefits. And the benefits outweigh the harms if only you give it the chance and the time. Yes, people are going to lose their job. Yes, someone's not going to be able to drive a taxi cab anymore, but eventually all of us will be a little bit better off. And I think that, what they're saying is just give technology a chance, give the iPhone a chance.
Dodge John Lennon.
Give peace a chance, yeah. But that's essentially what they're saying is like, hey, it's gone well every other time, but are they susceptible to this perhaps almost religious view of progress?
Well, I mean, in some ways, they're not wrong. I mean, in aggregate, that is true. Are we better off? Look at human longevity.
Right.
People are living into their 80s, 90s, and 100, and with much better quality of life than before. That said, the kind of demagogic populism that has sprung up in recent years, and we've seen it not just in the U.S. but elsewhere, is very much a product of certain people feeling that they have been left behind. But again, some historical perspective is helpful. Where are the horse and buggy, or the horse buggy, buggy whip makers from the early 20th century?
Right.
Technology is always throwing a curveball at us, often by accident. Imagine if you had invested big in developing better iron lungs for polio in the early 50s, suddenly Jonas Salk comes along with his vaccine. So there are those changes, and now is no different, except maybe in the scale, and that's also partly because there are way more people on the planet than they're used to. There's an interesting movement within history called Big History. It's somewhat related to environmental history and world history, but it takes the view that the whole historical spectrum must be traced all the way back to the beginning of the universe, and not simply to humanity. But the big historians and others have also come up in recent years with the notion of the period of the Anthropocene, which is not the period in which humans have been on the globe, but it's the period in which humans have been able to cause geological level change, not just biological level change, where you swap germs, as happened in the period of exploration,
or domesticated animals,
but sheer geological change, where we are fundamentally able to change the climate, and mainly for the negative. And that's a period of roughly 200 years, when there have been A, sufficient numbers of us on the planet, and B, we've had the technological ability to interfere with our own environment.
So it's as if 10,000 years ago, or from now, or even a million years from now, aliens come to our planet and take a look at what happened, and they'll see this thin layer of sediment where, wait a minute, things were weird at this time for this 250-year period. This is clearly a time when humans were running things, and they affected their planet in dramatic ways. And I'm hoping that it doesn't just last 250 years, but maybe that's a hope against the universe. I think that when we talk about a larger conception of history, if we go back to the Big Bang, for example, are we then getting back into the idea that we're maybe getting ahead of ourselves with progress, and that history is in fact cyclical, or are we missing something?
Well, I mean, we have to remember that we as a species have only been around for about 100,000 years. We've only been civilized for somewhat less than 10,000 years. And one of the history lessons I most remember from Mrs. Ward's grade 4 class in 1967 was the notion of geological time, that if you take the entire span of the universe's existence as a 24-hour day, we've been around since about 5 minutes to midnight.
Yeah. I think Carl Sagan did that, and Neil deGrasse in the show
Cosmos.
Cosmos, which is an excellent show. Another way to look at that, or just to look at the scale of the universe, that for every there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on the Earth, and that's just the observable universe.
That's right.
And so, when we talk of these grand ideas of story and what we're thinking of ourselves, we may be being deluded. But also, we don't know anything else, so we better get our story right.
It's the world we live in, and again, this was true for people in the Middle Ages. I mean, again, a sense of being in a fairly transitory world with well defined, well ordered into orders: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who labored. And of a world out there that they didn't know, but there be giants and dragons and monsters and so forth. But that above all that, there was a kind of cosmic intelligence, which they called God, this whole Christian version of the world, that sort of governed things. So in a sense, they did have a sense of their smallness. They had purpose. They all had, the lords and knights going off to fight, or often, for example, in the Crusades, they cast that as a kind of apocalyptic thing, although, frankly, a lot of it was about economic gain. But they obviously didn't have a sense of a big universe out there, but they did have a sense that there was a power greater than them, and that there was a kind of eternal world out there living in a kind of different sphere. And some of them actually thought of it in geographic terms, because, of course, their notion of the world, many of them did involve the Earth at the center, and then a series of concentric spheres holding the planets and the stars in place, and above that, God. Dante's Dante's Paradiso is a great sort of late medieval version of that.
Is it hubris for us to look at the present and apply these lessons from the past, or is it smart? And by that I mean, if we look at the Crusades and we can say after the fact that the Crusades had an economic lens to them, that there was an important economic agenda, even if the people who were doing it at the time had no idea that was going on. If we were to look back at this time now, from again, 1,000,000 years from now, with that kind of hindsight, or whatever it is, and say, well, clearly this is the result of environmental catastrophe, that this is what's happening to this species when they're faced with this, or with a rampant technological change. Is it a good idea for us to apply these lessons, or are we maybe hubristic in doing so?
Well, it's funny. I mean, over my career, I've gone back and forth on the issue of does history have anything to teach us? I mean, for centuries, it was believed that was history's primary role. It wasn't to chart a story. Right. It was to educate us.
Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it.
Well, that's a modern saying. That's George Santayana. But against him, I would oppose Hegel, who was definitely a capital H history person, and he had no time for the conventional humanist notion that the purpose of history was to learn from it, and that the examples from the past would repeat themselves in the present. Human nature is basically the same, and so forth. So I'm not sure it's hubristic. I mean, sometimes things do repeat themselves. I mean, there are some basic, I think we've learned by example that you have to stand up to bullies. Mm-hmm. The whole, if we'd acted sooner on the Nazis and Hitler, although again there are legitimately two schools of thought about that, and Chamberlain is always getting grief for having not stood up to Hitler earlier, but the fact of the matter is, as we now know, was Britain actually ready in 1938 to tackle Hitler's army? So it's hard to say. One of my favorite writers from the Renaissance is a Florentine historian called Francesco Guicciardini. He was a near contemporary, slightly younger than the more famous Machiavelli. Both of them were politicians and wrote historical books, but whereas Machiavelli was absolutely convinced that the past had lessons to teach us, and in fact he wrote his famous discourses on Livy's History of Rome precisely to teach lessons about how Italy could be restored to its republican glory in its various states. Guicciardini, in a very, very famous writing, argued that it was actually folly to continue to, cite the ancients at every turn and past example, because things are never exactly the same. The circumstances are always different and unique. And this, of course, was one of the great contributions of the 19th century German movement, known usually as historicism, is to reject that sort of notion of things being essentially the same and always repeating themselves, and focusing more on individuality, circumstance, and context. But if you ask the person on the street whether history has something to teach us, most people will answer in the affirmative. Whether we actually learn the lesson is a different issue, but most people, I think, still do subscribe to that notion that there is an educative role in history.
Well, speaking of that, there was one question. I don't know if we're going to have the time to ask it, but it was you've written a lot also about the danger of history being conflated with nationalism, and by that I mean that nation states over the last 200 years have co-opted the telling of history for their own purposes. And you've written a lot about that, and I wish we had time to dig into it. But more importantly, my last question, I think, has to be about jazz.
Okay. Now, that's a real non-sequitur. But,
I have no good segue. Yeah, I've got nothing to tie the two together. So why not just ask,
sure,
what on earth is going on with jazz?
Well, there's something else that I think has, in some ways, lost its center. And there's jazz and jazz. There's various different subgenres, and there's some I like more than others. I have to admit, really out there avant-garde jazz atonal is not really my thing. Then again, I'll listen to it before I'll listen to what is called smooth jazz, which I'm sure I'll get some hate mail about this, but which I don't actually regard as jazz at all. But one of the things I love about jazz is its ability to take the most mundane and banal piece of popular music and change it up in interesting ways. There's some, there's some just fantastic examples of that. I was in here recording some tracks with Ted the other day for my own show, Dark Glasses. And, we had some really interesting pieces on there, including some sessions from the last tour that John Coltrane and Miles Davis did in 1960 with some, it's on a bootleg series of Miles Davis recordings that have just come out, and very, very different take on his famous track "So What" than you get on the conventional kind of blue album. And I also put on some Beatles, not done by the Beatles, but done by assorted different jazz artists who can do different takes on it. So that's the most exciting and creative thing about it.
Was it Miles Davis who said that in jazz it's not about the notes you play, it's about the notes you don't play? Or was that
I don't know if he said that or not. It does sound like something Miles could have said.
Right.
But, that's sort of the equivalent of reading against the grain or something like that. It's true. There is. There's often you're expecting a particular tune and you can't find it because certain pieces are missing. But,
right, and jazz for me is interesting because it frustrates my expectations. It does something that maybe I didn't think it would do, and that I'm better for it. I'm better for having listened to it.
I think that's right, and I think probably if there's a particular era that I'm most fond of in terms of jazz, it's the bebop era from the mid to late 40s to right through to the early 60s, and when they started experimenting not simply with the melody and the sort of conventional swing sound from the 30s and early 40s, but with very, very complex chords and really focusing on the harmony rather than the melody. So geniuses like Charlie Parker, for example, and Dizzy Gillespie.
I don't. I have no idea what the connection is between what on earth is going on with jazz and what on earth is going on in our world today. I'm sure there is one, but I don't know. Any final thoughts?
Well, I don't have any idea what the connection is either, but I'm sure gonna go away and think about it and see if I can come up with some kind of clever connection between jazz and history and historiography.
Or if not clever, just something that that we can sink into and maybe think for a moment rather than constantly be disrupted by the news and constantly be disrupted by our own addiction to the news too.
Okay, well, here's an analogy. I think right now, if the world is in a sort of jazz state, it's not a very well organized one, and any instrument can come in at any time, and it doesn't have to pay attention to the rhythm or the melody or the chord structure, and thus it becomes very, very discordant. So some might call that noise rather than jazz.
Right, but it's the perfect template for that instrument to come in and do whatever it wants.
Yeah.
I think that's perfect for us to end.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. This has been great fun.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. That is the show. Thank you for listening to What on Earth is Going On. Remember that all episodes are available as a podcast, and they can be accessed through any podcast app or found on the website, along with links to social media at wogoshow.com. I would love to get your feedback, your questions, criticism, suggestions, whatever it is. Keep in touch. Now, your quote of the week is from George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the German philosopher who has been referenced on this show and will certainly be turned to again. Hegel said, "We learn from history that we do not learn from history." On the one hand, it's a pessimistic thought. What's the point, then, beyond the pleasure of learning in the ivory towers of knowledge? But there's another way to take it. We can't just copy and paste our history onto the present and expect to see the right lines to follow. We need to learn from the present how to deal with the present. But the only way we can know the present is to understand what came before, to know what we have usually done and haven't tried, and to see what might work this time around. We learn from history that we do not learn from history. Hegel does not say that we don't learn at all. Thanks for listening.